exposing language trickery used by Federal Reserve lawyers to make users of Federal Reserve notes into debt slaves. Written by Rick DiMare on July 5, 2018. As explained in many prior docs, the income tax adopted in October 1913, after the 16th Amendment in February 1913 removed the impediment for taxes on income derived from land and other property, was patterned after Chase's Civil War 10-year income tax, 1862 to 1872, which, at the start of the Civil War, was levied on income received in private state bank-issued notes, then on income received in both state and national bank-issued notes, and finally, after the 1869 VZ Bank case put an end to state banks of issue, the Civil War income tax fell only on income received in private national bank-issued notes. The Federal Reserve System, which simply combined all the Civil War nationalized banks of issue into one big corporate entity, was also adopted in 1913, and in this doc number 169, I will analyze the four major changes to the Fed's obligation clauses on its Federal Reserve notes, FRNs, since 1913. Keeping in mind that at no time between the start of the Civil War in 1861 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 were privately issued national banknotes ever made legal tender, but were only made voluntarily, quote, receivable, unquote, in the payment of debts and taxes. The only note that qualified to be legal tender in the post-Civil War era was the U.S. note, as the Supreme Court explained in Juilliard v. Greenman, 1884. Nevertheless, as we shall see, Fed lawyers finally managed to get legal tender status for the FRN, beginning with the 1934 series note, and the intent behind this legal maneuver was to guarantee that the Fed's loans to Congress would be paid back by wage earners, even if the debt could never really be paid back. Note number 1. Obligation language on 1914 and 1918 series Federal Reserve notes. Quote, this note is receivable by all national and member banks and Federal Reserve banks and for all taxes, customs, and other public dues. It is redeemable in gold on demand at the Treasury Department of the United States in the City of Washington, District of Columbia, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve bank, unquote. These are perhaps the most honest FRNs that will be issued, not because the notes are redeemable in gold, but simply because they are true promissory notes that borrow on Congress's coined money under the borrowing clause. Stated differently, the notes promise to pay the holder in Congress's current coin. Notice that the FRN has not been made legal tender yet, but is only voluntarily, quote, receivable, unquote. Also note that strict gold redemption can only occur at the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., but that if gold is demanded at a Federal Reserve bank, the bank has the option to either provide gold, quote, or lawful money, unquote, which can be any other currency that was then legal tender at the time, such as other U.S. coins or U.S. notes issued by Congress. However, since the FRN has not been made legal tender yet, redemption cannot be made in other FRNs. Note number 2. Obligation language on the 1928 series Federal Reserve notes. Quote, redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve bank, unquote. The FRN has not achieved legal tender status yet and is only, quote, receivable, unquote, but still is a true promissory note that borrows on Congress's coined money under the borrowing clause. The only minor change in this 1928 series FRN is to eliminate the requirement that gold redemption occur in Washington, D.C. After this 1928 series FRN, redemption can occur at any sub-treasury, no matter where it's located in the world. Note number 3. Obligation language on 1934 and 1950 series Federal Reserve notes. Quote, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury, or at any Federal Reserve bank, unquote. Here we have a radical change, not because the requirement to pay in gold is gone, but because the FRN has been made legal tender, which means it must be accepted when tendered. And by becoming a legal tender, it also means the FRN has become, quote, lawful money, unquote, which means the FRN no longer needs to be redeemed in Congress's coined money, but that redemption in other FRNs will suffice for legal purposes. In short, the FRN is no longer a legitimate promissory note, but a falsified one, and the FRN no longer affects the borrowing of Congress's coined money under the borrowing clause. Note number 4. Obligation language on the 1963 series to present Federal Reserve note. Quote, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, unquote. Same as note number 3, but the false implication that this note will be redeemed in Congress's coined money has been removed, and the true legal nature of the FRN is fully revealed. It is not a promissory note, but a note of indebtedness. That is, evidence that the holder of the FRN is indebted to the shareholders of the Federal Reserve banks. Necessary and proper clause. Quote, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Unquote. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. In conclusion, I present the necessary and proper clause because, as established in the 9 legal tender cases, 1868 to 1884, before Congress can grant legal tender status to a currency, it must be both a necessary and proper means of borrowing money under the borrowing clause. Federal Reserve Notes number 1 and number 2 accomplish this, and are therefore, quote, proper, unquote, under the necessary and proper clause, but Federal Reserve Notes number 3 and number 4 do not. Also, as stated in the first paragraph above, Congress has had the power to issue its own U.S. notes as legal tender since Juilliard v. Greenman, 1884, which means that neither of the 4 versions of FRNs were really, quote, necessary, unquote, for Congress to carry out any of its Article 1, Section 8 duties. It could be argued by Fed lawyers that it's, quote, necessary, unquote, under the necessary and proper clause for Congress to grant legal tender status to a redeemable FRN so that the Federal Reserve banks can lend out its deposits. But Congress is not charged with the duty, quote, to lend money, unquote, anywhere in Article 1, Section 8. Congress is only charged with the duties, quote, to coin money, unquote, in Clause 5, and, quote, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, unquote, in Clause 2.